And I'm here to talk to you today about grief and when religion doesn't help. Religion, is something that we think helps in grief and should help in grief, but sometimes it doesn't. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to give you guys a keynote presentation. Let me know when you can see this. Look good? All right. All right, so I want to talk about how belief can actually hinder the grief process when God doesn't help. So what we're going to talk about today is, first of all, the basics. We need to talk about what is religion. I'll talk a little bit about who I am, and I'll tell you why that's important. I'm assuming most of you are probably professionals and you're working with clients. And what I really want to do is give you some perspective if your client is being caught up by religion that's not helping the grief, to understand where it is they're coming from. I'm going to talk about problems with having a particular religion. I'm going to talk mostly today about Abrahamic religions. I'm going to talk specifically about Christianity. The reason for that is twofold. One is I am a Christian, or I was raised as a Christian. The other thing, those are the religions that are most popular, are most prevalent in our culture and kind of permeate our culture. And I also think they happen to be the religions that have the biggest issues, particularly Christianity. I'm going to talk about the issues with Christianity. We'll talk about God, whether God is either weak or angry, because I think in most Christianity, the belief is God is either one or the other. And I'll explain more why I believe that when we get into it. We're going to talk about what I call the insanity of penal substitutionary atonement. And you may not have heard that term. I'll define it as we get into it. I'm going to give you an example of some Christian preaching so you can understand what people might be hearing when they go to church on Sunday mornings. I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the absolute worst Christian teaching, the one that really tore me up for a very long time. I'll talk about some mitigating factors in Christianity and why those kind of developed over time. I'm going to talk about why would anyone believe any of this? If you're a person that came across this maybe later in your life, you might wonder, why would anybody believe any of this insanity? And I'll talk about why that is. I'm going to talk about something that's called the prosperity gospel and why that is so insidious, in my opinion. I'll talk about how people are indoctrinated into Christianity, oftentimes as in people are indoctrinated into cults. I will talk about beliefs that hinder the processing of grief. I'll talk about something called Christian universalism, which you may or may not have heard of. And I'll tell you why I think that might be a way for people who are Christians and who are Bible believing, maybe to start to escape some of this insanity. And then I'm going to finish up with talking about what is it that we can do about all this.
Hey, Brian, we're seeing two screens at one time, so we're not seeing the slide on full screen.
All right, let me see what's going on here. Oh, I'm sorry, I think I know what the problem is. No, that's not the problem. So you're seeing both screens?
There we go. Now it's the one.
Okay. All right. I'm going to be looking off to the side because my notes are over there. That's okay. All right. So I apologize for that. Thanks for letting me know. So one of the root meanings of the word religion comes from the Latin religare, which means to fasten, to bind, or to tie. Now, that's actually good in that religion can tie us together. And religion is defined in the dictionary as the belief and worship of a superhuman power, especially a personal god or gods. The problem is when religion ties us to something that's not healthy for us, when religion ties us to traditions that don't let us explore, don't let us ask questions. So that's when I think religion can actually become a problem. So I'll tell you a little bit more about me. I was raised in a Pentecostal family. I don't know if you've heard the word Pentecostal or not. It's a particular sect of Christianity. And even more specifically that, I was raised as an apostolic. Pretty strict beliefs, like, for example, no dancing, no drinking, no smoking, women couldn't wear pants, pretty strict set of beliefs. My grandfather was actually the pastor and the founder of the church that I attended. His parents were both pastors. So I was steeped in this from the time I was born. I jokingly say I was born a Christian. Of course, no one's born a Christian, but when you're born into a family where everybody is a Christian and you're expected to be a Christian and you're taken to Sunday school from the time that you could, before I could even walk or talk, you kind of feel like that's something you were born into. I just said my grandfather was the pastor of my church. I was taught what's called Bible literalism. Now, a lot of times people who are not raised in a faith will read the Bible metaphorically and have an understanding that the Bible is not meant to be taken literal. But there are a number of people who read the Bible who think it's absolutely to be taken literally. They also believe the Bible is inerrant, like it was handed down from God. So those two particular beliefs can really mess you up, especially considering so much of the Bible is metaphor. Jesus actually taught in parables. If you start to take these things literally, you can see how they kind of fall apart. Later in my life, I became an evangelical, which you're probably aware of now, because the evangelical movement has gotten really big since like the 1980s, I would think. So I became an evangelical Christian after I was raised as a Pentecostal, but I was frankly very deeply scarred by religion. The idea that there was this God who was always watching over me, who was judging me. I was born into what's called original sin, and we'll talk more about what that is and what the belief is. But I was born basically as an enemy of God. I was never going to be good enough to measure up. I was only saved by Jesus' sacrifice. So all of those things were going through my head from the time I was a very small child. I eventually ended up going on my own journey. When I was about 30 years old, I got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore. And for a lot of people, there's a breaking point. For me, it was actually when my uncle, who was gay, was murdered. And I remember talking to my brother one day, and he made a comment to me like, too bad that our uncle is in hell. And I was taken aback by that. My uncle was a very good person. The only issue was he was gay, so therefore he wasn't able to join the church. And that was kind of the breaking point for me. I never really embraced this idea of a guy that would send people eternally to hell. But when it becomes personal for people, that's a lot of times when people will actually start to either break away from their faith or their faith starts to break them down. So after this, I studied the Bible quite a bit. I did a lot of reading. I got on the internet and I found this group called Christian Universalists. And what Christian Universalists believe, they still are Christians. They still believe in Jesus, still believe in Jesus' sacrifice even. But they believe that the sacrifice of Jesus covers everybody, all people. So that was a step away from that fundamentalism for me. Eventually, I ended up leaving religion. After I started studying Christianity more deeply, understood where the Bible came from, understood some of the insanity about some of the stuff. I started studying other religions. I studied Kabbalah. I studied Buddhism and Hinduism, not as a academic thing, not in school or anything, but just reading a lot, as much as I could read about it. And I understood that there is a lot of overlap in all the religions, and I didn't feel like any one particular religion fit me. So I call myself now spiritual, but not religious, like a lot of people are coming to. Now, I did not become an atheist. I am not a materialist. I still am a believer, if you want to put it that way, and that we are spiritual beings. So I didn't leave that part of my faith, but I just left the biblical inerrancy, the fact that you have to be a Christian to go to heaven and those types of things. The thing about religion is there are so many of them. And which one is right? You know, I was raised as a Christian. As I said, when I started looking at other religions, I realized there's a whole lot of overlap. Most religions at their core teach the same basic things, which we would expect. There's one universal truth. But every religion focuses on what they believe exclusive to other religions, or not every religion, I should say, but the religion I was raised in. So we focused on the differences as opposed to what we had in common. So as I said, there is some exclusivity between the different faiths, but it's less than people really perceive that are in those faiths. I believe that there are many paths to the mountaintop. I think that only makes sense. But in the faith that I grew up in, this was anathema. You would never say that there are many paths to the mountaintop. There was one path, and it was the path that we were on. Anybody else on any other path was not going to get there. And you might run into clients that actually believe that. Now, there's some, no one knows exactly how many denominations of Christianity there are, but there are somewhere between 30 and 40,000. I've seen different numbers, but let's just say there are thousands of denominations of Christianity. And these have developed over time because people would split over minor things. Someone would say, well, when you get baptized, it should be the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Someone else would say it should be in the name of Jesus. And if you baptize in the wrong way, then that person is not going to get into heaven. Some people believe that, for example, when we take communion, we should drink literal wine. Other people believe we should drink grape juice. All these things, if you can imagine over a course of 2,000 years, has led to split after split after split. So even Christianity is actually not a universal thing. It's extremely fragmented. And again, in the faith that I was grew up in, we were taught, for example, that Catholics weren't going to go to heaven because Catholics didn't speak in tongues. And I was brought up in a tradition where we had to speak in tongues to show that you received the Holy, we call it the Holy Ghost at the time, not the Holy Spirit. So this is some of the things that go on even within Christianity. You might think, well, all Christians believe that all Christians are going to heaven, or all Christians believe that all Christians are the same. It's not true at all. It's actually, there's a lot of division even within Christianity. So as I said, I'm going to focus on Christianity. I'm going to focus on the Abrahamic traditions because, again, that's kind of what I know, but it's also what's most prevalent in our society. And it seems to me from when I've studied other faiths to be the ones that are the most exclusive, which means they're the ones that could cause the most harm when we're in grief. Most other traditions seem to say, well, you're kind of okay if you're not one of us, at least you're not going to be condemned to hell. As I've studied it, there are only a couple of faiths I believe that really even teach an eternal hell. But in terms of like just not believing the right thing, now there are some Jews, I believe, I think a small segment that believe in hell. Some Muslims believe in hell, but again, those are also Abrahamic faiths as well. So as I said, this is one of the few, Christianity is one of the few people that by and large believe in something that's called hell, which is an eternal place of torment that you can never escape. And that we'll talk about later as to why I think that is such a terrible belief. It is a predominant faith, as I said, in the US and in the West. And many denominations in Christianity have toxic and confusing views. And I'm going to go into detail about what some of these confusing views are, but they really fall apart upon close examination. So you're taught to take them on faith. You just have to believe the stuff that they tell you and believe that the Bible is inerrant. So therefore, even though it says this in one place and this in another place, it all somehow makes sense. So let's talk about what the issues are. The one thing, and this is kind of the foundation of everything for me anyway, is this idea of original sin. So what some Christians believe, and they believe the Bible teaches, is that when Adam sinned, when Eve gave him the fruit to eat, and they disobeyed God and they were cast out from the Garden of Eden, that sin not only cursed Adam to cursed Adam to being a sinner, but it curses all of us. So we're all born sinful. Now, most of us will look at a baby and think of a baby as being innocent. A baby has not done anything wrong. A baby does not have evil intentions. I think most of us would agree with that. But that's the exact opposite of what a lot of Christianity teaches. It teaches that we are born as an enemy to our Creator. And that belief just haunted me for the entire time I was growing up, because I was like, why is God so angry at me for something that I didn't do? Why did God create me if he's going to create me like this? Now, for a lot of people, they kind of slough this off. It doesn't really bother them. But for people that are sensitive or people who think about things deeply, they can take this in, and it can really cause lasting damage from childhood all the way up through being an adult, because you're a bad person. We're all bad people. There's, again, I said exclusivity and extremism in some of these faiths. I remember being taught that, not only do you sin in your actions, you can sin through your thoughts. So if you have a bad thought, God knows that that's a sin. This is a pretty extreme teaching. If you think about it, we all don't have full control of our minds. We all think things that maybe we shouldn't think. We all think of things that maybe we would never even do. I was taught that there was this God who was listening to every thought I had and judging me. And not only that, that was a mark against me. And if I died in that sin, I would be condemned to hell for something as small as having a bad thought, because I was taught that all sins are the same. So whether you steal a candy bar or you murder somebody, it's all sin. Now, again, this might sound extreme to you. It may be something that you haven't heard before. I don't know. But this is the teaching in many churches, because it's a black and white type of thinking. You're in or you're out. You're good or you're bad. So again, there's heaven and there's hell. There's two extremes. There's extreme bliss that you go to if you happen to be of the right religion, said the right prayers, have the right faith. You go to heaven. Everybody else goes to a place of eternal torment. There is no in between. There is no medium place. There was a TV show that I loved. It was on NBC a few years ago. It was a comedy called The Good Place, and it was on for about 4 or 5 years. Fantastic show. But one of the premises of the show is there's a good place and a bad place, and eventually, a few seasons in, they got into like, most people belong in the medium place. Most of us are not saints. Most of us are not, demons. Most of us are kind of medium, but there's no room for that in the faith that I grew up in. You couldn't be a good person. You had to be in. You had to have the right beliefs. So again, this thinking that people have, if a loved one passes, or if we're worried about our own passing and we're going through grief, and we think, like in the case of my uncle, great guy, never hurt a person, loved him, great, but because he wasn't in the church, he was going to be tortured eternally. That's what I mean when I say black and white thinking. There is a cult-like indoctrination in these faiths. You're taught that the only place you can get truth is in the church. You're taught that the only people that really love you are in the church. You're taught that the word is the Bible is perfect, and as is interpreted by men, often by your pastor, your priest, or whatever, that's what you need to understand, you need to believe. And you're kind of inoculated from the rest of the world. So as you're talking to your clients that have been indoctrinated into this, and you might think, well, I'm going to come at them with reason. I'm going to come at them with logic. I'm going to come at them with science. The most important thing in these teachings is faith. And even more so, a lot of times faith is actually the opposite of logic. As it's taught to them, it's the opposite of logic and reason. You're taught not to question, and you're taught that these other things are deceptive. So I give you an example. I do a lot of interviews with people who have had near-death experiences. And near-death experiences, I believe, tell us a lot about the afterlife from people who have actually been there. But when I post my interviews on YouTube, a lot of Christians will say, oh, no, this is not biblical. The guy did not mention Jesus. He didn't mention the Bible. He didn't mention hell. So therefore, I reject everything he said because it doesn't line up with my understanding of this book. And so instead of people actually examining evidence, instead of people even examining firsthand evidence, they'll say, no, I reject that because it's not part of my tradition. This strips people of their autonomy, of their power. You are taught that you have no agency to be a good person even. One of the verses that stands out to me is like, our righteousness is as filthy rags. So what that means is everything that we do, no matter how good we think we're being, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to God, because nothing you can do is good. There's a concept in Calvinism, which is a big part of Christianity, that's called total depravity. And what total depravity means is that we are all totally depraved, literally. We all cannot do anything good of our own. We cannot save ourselves, so nothing that we can do. And this is where some of the contradictions come in, right? So we're taught that we can't save ourselves, but we're taught we can only save ourselves by believing in Jesus. So in that way, we are actually saving ourselves, because they'll tell us, well, Jesus' sacrifice was only for the people who actually make that confession. So you can see how this is a self-contradicting thing, but it's what a lot of people believe. And they'll say, and they really believe, they think it, that you can't save yourself. And then in the next breath, they'll tell you, but you must do this to be saved. This could cause self-hatred, because if your creator hates you, and that's the only thing I can say about a creator who would condemn someone to eternal torment, they must hate them. If your creator hates you, then how can you love yourself? So a lot of times people that grow up in these faiths, and I'll speak for myself, we know that we're not really good people. We know that deep down inside we have these bad thoughts, that God's judging us. And no matter how good other people may tell us we are, no matter how, no matter how many good things we might do, we're always thinking about that one bad thing that we did, that one, unconfessed sin in some cases. In some traditions, you had to actually confess every sin that you did. And people would actually say prayers to confess unconfessed sins. So it's like, let me cover all the ones that I missed. So imagine this thinking as you're going about your day, and you cut somebody off in traffic, or you snap at somebody, or whatever it is, some minor thing that you might have done, and that is as held against you as much as if you actually literally murdered somebody. And that was the teaching that I grew up with. And it's an all or nothing gamble. It's you're, like I said, you're in or you're out. It's heaven or hell. I remember when I did get some counseling, when I was in my late 30s, I think it was, talking to my counselor, and I'm like, okay, I know I'm not good enough to go to heaven. I'm never going to make it to heaven, because I really literally could not love this guy that had this system set up. But I don't want to go to hell either. So I'm like, I remember telling, I just want a little corner in heaven where I can just be by myself and not, at least not be sent to hell. That's the kind of thinking that can come about from this, again, all or nothing thing, because I knew I didn't deserve eternal bliss. I knew that I was never going to make it to that level, but I certainly didn't want to be tormented for all of eternity either. And I literally, when I was a child, wished that I had never been born. I'm like, why would I take this gamble? Why would I come to this place and take this gamble? I'd rather literally not exist than exist with the threat of eternal torment hanging over me. And again, I think that this makes God either weak or unloving. Either God cannot save us, and we'll talk about what that means later on, but either God can't save us, or he's just decided he's not going to. And if God is a loving creator, if God is a parent that loves each of us as children of God, why would he allow the majority of us, not allow, send us to be tormented? So some lessons that are taught by traditional Christianity. I'm broken and need to be saved. It's a very prevalent lesson in Christianity, in traditional Christianity. Again, there are people that don't believe this, and they are Christians, but these are words more traditional. I can't trust myself. I was taught your heart is deceptive and evil. Do not lean on your own understanding. Your righteousness is as filthy rags. All these verses I was taught. I am nothing without God, and I'm separate from God. I've come to believe that we're all part of God. God's all part of us. We can't be separate from God. Ironically, Christianity teaches that we are separate from God and we're nothing without God, which means we're nothing. We're taught that our desires are sinful. Again, I talked about the heart is wicked, is a verse that people are taught. My spiritual self is all that matters. Physicality doesn't matter. The earth doesn't matter. There are people now that believe, frankly, it doesn't matter what we do to the earth, because God's either going to save it or it doesn't matter, because we're all just spirit beings anyway. So we're taught to ignore the very human parts of ourselves. We're taught that we're responsible for saving other people. There's a big concept in Christianity, a big, proselytizing, going out and saving other people, the Great Commission. Jesus sent us forth to save the world. So if you have this idea, then you're thinking, I've got to go tell everybody. I've got to tell my family. I've got to tell them I'm responsible for my children. I'm responsible for my family. And we're taught there's only one right way to live, that the way that we live is right because we're living by this book, the way that we interpret it. Anybody that reads it any other way is wrong. So these things are very harmful teachings, in my opinion. So there's this idea of original sin. I don't know if you can see this because it kind of went off the side of the screen, but there's a baby. He's like, I just got here. What did I do? And this was my feeling when I was a child. This idea that we are born counter to God. Now, there's some verses in the Bible, I think, that support this, but there's some other verses in the Bible that really support the idea that we're not born in sin anymore. So, and the thing is, I want to give you tools to help people from where they are. We can't go to someone that's steeped in religion and just pull them out by logic. So I always start with the Bible. I always start with biblical logic, for example. So there's a verse in the passage in Romans that says, "For just the right time, we were still powerless. Christ died for the ungodly. And surely anyone would die for a righteous man, though for a good man, someone might possibly dare to die. But God proves his love for us with this: while we're still sinners, Christ died for us." Now, I think that's a really important verse, because this verse says that Jesus died for us when we were sinners, when we were supposedly enemies from God. And then he goes on to say, "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through his sin, so also death passed." I'm sorry, my camera's in front of the screen here. "Death was passed on to all men because all have sinned." So that's what he says, all have sinned. But he goes on to say that if Adam's sin was passed on everybody, then so was Jesus' sacrifice. And that's the point I want to get to. Now, when you go through this passage with some people, they'll read the first all as an all were condemned by Adam's sin as all. They'll read the second all that Jesus saved as only the ones that actually accept Jesus' sacrifice. But that's not what the verse says. So this is a place at least to start with some people. And there are other verses in the Bible that support this idea of Christian universalism, which I believe is a step better, at least, than the conditional salvation, because it teaches that Jesus' sacrifice was for everybody. It's still penal substitutionary atonement. It's still the idea that God had to kill Jesus to save all of us, but at least it applies to everybody. And it's a good first step out of that mindset. So I already talked about these points. It's kind of built the wrong way. We're all born enemies of God. Now, there's a logical and very disturbing conclusion from this original sin. Again, if you think about a baby, and I won't name specific denominations, but there are still some denominations that believe if a baby is born and is not baptized before it passes, before it dies, then that baby goes to hell. Now, this goes against all of our common sense. It goes against any sense of compassion, but it's the logical conclusion. If you're born in sin, and the moment you enter the world that you are sinful, and if God can't abide sin and you die in your sin, that you're going to go to hell for eternity. So the conclusion would be that babies go to hell. And we'll talk about some of the mitigating factors, because people really couldn't grasp that, or really couldn't account or deal with that. So when I was in school, in Sunday school, they taught this thing called age of accountability as kind of a compromise. It's like, well, you're not really going to go to hell until at least you understand that you're sinful, which is really interesting because you're supposedly sinful anyway. But this is age of accountability. Now, this is not a biblical concept as far as I can tell. I can't find any support for this anywhere in the Bible. But at least I give them credit for saying, yeah, let's not send babies and little children to hell. But then when I was a child, I remember being taught, you've got to be baptized, you've got to speak in tongues, you've got to do all these things. And my parents saying, no, you're not ready. You're 5 or 6. You're not ready to really accept this responsibility yet. You have to wait. So I'm going to Sunday school and they're teaching me I'm going to go to hell if I die. My parents are telling me I need to wait till I'm older so I can make an informed decision. And I'm in this limbo land. And the Bible doesn't specify an age. It doesn't say 13. It's not, as I said, it's not even really in the Bible. So this is one of the conundrums with this idea of original sin. So this leads to something that I'm even hesitant to bring up because it's so sick, but it's logical. There have been people who have had children who have murdered their children before they reach the age of accountability, because they're like, if I let my child reach the age of accountability and they don't accept Jesus, they're going to hell. If I murder them before they reach the age of accountability, they'll go to heaven. People have literally done this. People have literally killed their children because of this teaching. And there's a book, it's called Christianity Without Insanity. It's by a guy named Boyd Purcell, and he talks about some of this and he gives some examples. Now, again, these are extreme things. Most people do not go to these lengths, but these things are actually logical if you take these teachings literally. And unfortunately, some people do. So I mentioned before that God is either weak or God is angry. And I'm going to talk about logically why I say that. So there's basically two parts of mainstream Christianity. One is Calvinism, the other is Arminianism. In Calvinism, God literally creates some people for damnation. This is the strong God, I would call him. So God is in control. God says, okay, I know some of you are going to go to hell and some of you are going to be saved, but I'm the one in control. So I am creating people. I'm creating certain people that they're called the elect, and they're going to go to heaven. The flip side of that, of course, is God's creating most of us for damnation. And again, the logic of this just defies me. You're creating beings that you know that you're going to eternally torment, and they literally have no choice in this. God's love is limited to his elect in Calvinism. So in Calvinism, God loves the elect and he hates everybody else. You have no control over your fate or your salvation in Calvinism. So the people that are saved, they get no credit. So I'll give them consistency for this when they say you can't save yourself, because you can't. God's love is irresistible. So there's a 5-letter acronym called TULIP, and one of them stands for irresistible. God pulls these people no matter what they decide that he's going to save them. So again, that's TULIP, that stands for total depravity, which means that we're all totally depraved. We can do no good out of ourselves. Unconditional election. So you are elected, you are saved, not based on any conditions, not based on anything you have ever said or done or could say or do. It's based upon just on God's will. There's a limited atonement. So we talked about atonement before, this idea that Jesus died for our sins, but Jesus only died for the sins of some, only for the sins of the elect. There's irresistible grace. Again, you have no choice. If you're saved, God just pulls you. He makes you be saved. And there's perseverance of the saints, which means that you cannot lose your salvation. So once you're saved, you're always saved no matter what. So that's the acronym TULIP. So on the flip side of that, we have Arminianism. So in Arminianism, God loves everyone. God wills to save everyone. But there's a problem. God has given us something called free will. And free will makes God saving us beyond his control. It's up to us. So this is what I call the weak version of God. This is a guy that says, okay, I'm going to create my creation. I'm going to set them free, and they can decide whether they want to come home or not. And there's nothing I can do about it. Their free will is so strong, I can't override it. And these people will have you believe that we actually choose hell. And I've had these debates with people. Will people choose hell? Well, nobody in their right mind would make an informed decision to choose eternal torment, but that's what they've kind of talked themselves into believing. So again, this idea that your free will allows you to choose hell, which that just makes no sense at all to me. So again, in Bible logic, we talked about Calvinism, we talked about Arminianism. So in Calvinism, God is all powerful and God gets what he wants, but he chooses not to save everyone. In Arminianism, God is not all powerful. We each get free will and God is powerless to save some of us. But there's an idea called universalism, which is what I came to before I left Christianity entirely, which says that God is all powerful, that God does will for everyone to be saved, and that all are saved. And this is actually a perspective that you can get to through a particular reading of the Bible. I was going to say proper reading of the Bible. It's proper in my opinion, but you can read this in the Bible. There's a book by a guy named Thomas Talbot. It's called the Inescapable Love of God. And he's a teacher, he's a professor, and it's a great, great book that uses Bible verses, uses logic to come to the conclusion that God must save everyone. And then it comes to the conclusion of universalism. Again, using the Bible and using logic, and using this type of logic we're talking about here. And saying, okay, I'm going to give credit to God for being powerful. I'm going to give credit to God for loving everyone. Therefore, everyone must be saved. And he talks about how that could come about. So I've alluded to this several times already, but I want to go into more detail about penal substitutionary atonement. This idea is that Adam passed sin to the whole human race. And again, I'm not sure what your guys' backgrounds are. So there's this idea that whether it's through the DNA or however it is, somehow magically But when Adam sinned, everybody got this, what's called sinful nature. And it's not just the fact that we have a sinful nature that we will sin. And I remember when I was a kid thinking, okay, well, that means that we're going to sin. And of course, we've all sinned. It goes even beyond that. It's that we are born with this like mark on us that we are sinners. So I say, well, God gave us free will, right? He put Adam and Eve in the garden, again, taking the story literally. He put fruit in the garden that looked desirable. And he had to know at some point they were going to eat this fruit because it was knowledge. It was a knowledge of good and evil. Now that story, when it's read properly, I think is a beautiful story. It's a beautiful myth that has really deep meaning. And I learned this, frankly, when I was an evangelical and I was talking to my Jewish friend. He goes, we don't read that story literally, but Christians do. And when you read it literally, it's like, oh, come on, God, what are you doing? It's like putting a 2-year-old in a room with a chocolate cake and walking out and saying, whatever you do, don't touch that cake. That's literally what he did with Adam and Eve. And the thing is, God commands us to forgive. The Bible tells us over and over again to forgive. Jesus talked over and over again about forgiving. Forgive your brother 70 times 7, which doesn't mean 490 times or even 4,900 times if you read 70 times 70. That what he was saying was over and over, as much as necessary. Forgive. And forgiving is giving up any idea of being repaid. So God commands us to forgive each other. But then the penal substitutionary atonement says God doesn't forgive. Really, God demands payment. So it'd be like, let's say that if you do believe that when we sin, we owe something to God. So God demands payment. So Jesus comes along, Jesus pays the price. Jesus dies, he pays for everybody. But then God says, but if you don't accept it, I'm going to demand payment from you too. To me, that's double dipping. If you do believe that Jesus paid the price for everybody's sins, then why is God still demanding payment? And if God is demanding payment, then it's not forgiveness. So I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but these are the things that were spinning through my mind when I was being taught this. And I'm like, wait a minute. I'm supposed to forgive this person that harmed me, but God can't forgive me. And it really just doesn't make sense when you really think about it. Because again, God only accepts Jesus' payment. This is if you're a Calvinist. If you actually do certain things. Well, actually, even a Calvinist or an Arminian. Either way, you believe that you have to be saved by accepting Jesus' payment. Then this gets you another conundrum. All sin is forgivable except for the sin of not believing. And this is what universalists say. This doesn't make any sense. If all sin is forgivable, then even the sin of not believing should be forgivable, and that shouldn't condemn you to hell. So again, bringing this back to, as you're working with clients, what you can do is kind of gently point out some of these things. Like if God is all loving and that God forgives, then why does he demand payment? And if he demanded payment and Jesus paid the price, then why is he still demanding payment? And if all sin is forgivable, then your loved one that died not believing, why wouldn't that sin be forgiven? And just kind of plant those questions in people. And the other thing that is really ironic is for us people that became universalists, then they started telling us that we were going to go to hell because we didn't believe in hell anymore. So it's like you have to, they added this other condition on to being saved, that you had to believe in hell, which I just never could do. I do want to say that hell is not mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures at all. The Bible translations are notoriously terrible, especially the King James. There's a lot of times when the word hell is used, when it should have been Sheol for the grave, or Gehenna, when Jesus talked about a garbage dump outside of Jerusalem called Gehenna. So newer biblical translations are getting better. And there's actually, I think, a book out called Why Hell is Disappearing from the Bible. But that's not really even mentioned. And I think about it, it's like, okay, if this is such an important thing, if we're literally risking eternal torment, when God gave Adam that warning in the garden, why didn't he say, not only will you die, I will torment you eternally? There's nothing like that in the Hebrew Bible. Actually, even individual salvation isn't mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures. They talk about the saving of nations or tribes, but this idea of individual salvation is relatively new. It came about with Christianity. I'm going to give you a real quick example. This is an extreme example, but this is taught to a little bit lesser level in Christian churches. This is a sermon by a guy named Jonathan Edwards. He said, "Your wickedness makes as you are heavy as lead and tend downwards with great weight and pressure towards hell. And if God should let you go, you'd immediately sink and swiftly descend, plunge into the bottomless gulf, and your healthy constitution and your care and prudence and best contrivance and all your righteousness would have no more influence to uphold you and keep you out of hell than a spider's web that would have to stop a falling rock. Were it not so, the sovereign pleasure of God, the earth would not bear you one moment, for you are burdened to it. The creation groans with you. The creation is made subject to the bondage of your corruption, not willingly. The sun don't willingly shine upon you to give you light to serve sin and Satan. The earth don't willingly yield her increase to satisfy your lusts, nor is it willingly a stage for your wickedness to be acted upon her. The air don't willingly serve for your breath to maintain the flame of life in your vitals, while you spend your life in the service of God's enemies." Now, this is an actual excerpt from a sermon called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And this was like, I think in the 1800s. People don't preach like this too much anymore, but this is a really good encapsulation of what some people's view of God are and some people's view of mankind, that we are really an enemy to God that he can barely stand to look at. The worst teaching, again, I said, is heaven and hell. I've talked extensively about this. As far as I can tell, the idea of eternal torment without cease and without chance of escape seems to be pretty exclusive to Christianity. Some other places have like temporary punishment, but really not much like that. So it's a permanent state of torment. The thing is interesting also, we're bound there by default. By default, when we come into this world with original sin, we're on our way to hell unless we find a way out of it. There's no control once we're there. There is no escape. Again, I talked about earlier, this is either the good place or the bad place. And I think this is really it goes against any sense we have of judgment. Imagine a judge that every case that comes in front of him, he gives them death penalty. Someone comes in, they've run a stop sign, death penalty. Someone's stolen a candy bar, death penalty. Someone's murdered someone, death penalty. That's what the idea of heaven is like, or hell is like. There's one punishment for everybody, no matter what. And it's infinite, it's eternal. There is no escape from it. So I give you, it's funny or interesting to me. I thought about this when I was a kid, and it drove me crazy. But when you talk to a lot of Christians about this, they don't really conceive of this. And so I would push people. And I was at lunch one day with a couple of friends. One was a pastor, the other was on board of our church. And we were sitting in a restaurant. I looked around the room. I said, "Do you guys really believe that most of the people in this room are going to hell?" And we're sitting right next to I-75 outside the window. I said, "All those people driving up and down I-75, most of them are going to hell." And they're like, "Well, yeah, we do." And I've said, "So this is eternal punishment. They're literally going to be punished eternally." Yeah, I'm like, how can you sit here and eat lunch? Why aren't you out screaming and shouting about this? And they're like, "Well, we believe that, God's in control and God's way is above ours." My point is, eventually when I would push people, they kind of say, "I don't really believe that. I just kind of believe it." But keep in mind, some people do. And this can drive you to insanity, literally. So some mitigating factors. Again, I talked about people, the idea of heaven and hell, I think is too extreme for most people. There's an idea called purgatory. It's a temporary place. It's kind of in between. We can go either up or down from there. We can pray people out of it. When I found out about that, I was like, that's cool. At least there's something that's in between heaven and hell. Some people believe in annihilation. They believe that eternal life is conditional. So they've come to the conclusion, it doesn't make sense to torment anybody eternally, but people that aren't saved just disappear, just no longer exist. And then there's the age of accountability, which I've already gone over. So you might wonder, why would anybody believe this? Well, again, we're indoctrinated often at a very early age. Very few people convert to these extreme forms of Christianity. Some people do, but very few adults will buy into this. So keep in mind, when you're dealing with people, a lot of times these beliefs were put into them very early and they're very deeply held. Again, they use cult-like techniques for indoctrination. There are poor biblical translations. I encourage people, go out and get yourself at least a good modern Bible, stop reading the King James, which sends everybody to hell in the Old Testament. Exclusivity can feel good. Sometimes we feel like I'm part of this group. I want to be part of this group and we're better than everybody else. So one of the things that I was thinking when I was a kid, it's like, okay, we've got this guy, this Father God, and he says, I'm going to throw a party and we're in afterlife, right? I'm going to throw a party for all my good kids. And we're going to be at their partying, and we're partying realizing that our brothers and sisters are in the basement being tormented by this same host. Who can love this God? And this was the problem for me. I could never love this guy, which is why I thought I was bound for hell for a long time. I'm going to go over really quickly the prosperity gospel, the law of attraction, and why this is a problem. The prosperity gospel is what a lot of Christians call the law of attraction. And what it basically says is that if we do the right things, if we say the right things, if we pray the right things, then everything will be okay. And this is really nowhere in the Bible. There are some verses you can cherry pick, but people do believe this. And the problem is someday something's going to go wrong. And when this happens, people look to themselves and say, God is punishing me. My daughter died because I sinned. My husband was killed in that auto accident because I sinned. Everything is around me, and it's around my belief. Something someday is going to go wrong. You're going to get sick. You're going to not have money. That's the nature of being on earth. And again, there's biblical passages to back that up. But this is an idea that's deeply pervasive in a lot of Christians. A lot of times it's unspoken, it's unsaid. And you'll find out when people go through grief, they'll come to you and say, I didn't pray hard enough. I didn't pray for her that day when she left the house. Or I sinned, and that's why I had a miscarriage. Things of that nature. I talked already about the cult-like indoctrination. I believe this is actually a form of child abuse to teach children this. So it's taught that we need to be absolutely loyal to the church. There's a lot of chanting and meditation in some of these things that we taught at an early age. We were taught to conform. I was telling you, we were taught to dress a certain way, to be separate from the world, to not play cards, things like that. So again, dress, language, stuff like that. There's doctrinal confusion. Sometimes it seems like more incomprehensible things we're teaching us, the better, because then they can say, just take it on faith. Don't think about it. Doesn't make sense to torment people eternally. Just turn it over to God. Just trust in God. Just pray about it. Again, exclusivity, you're either in or you're out. There's financial involvement. There's a teaching called tithing in Christianity that some churches teach that you have to give 10% of your gross income to the church. If you don't, you're going to go to hell. And then there's love bombing. It's like, the only place you're going to get love is from us. And peer pressure. These are things that are actually done by cults to get people in. And there's a guy that went through and did like 20 items of cult-like behavior and applied them to the Christian church. And frankly, all 20 of them applied. Now, again, I'm not here to put down Christianity. I think Christianity is great, but I'm just trying to help you understand the mentality of some people that you're going to deal with. So I talked about the psychological damage, and this cartoon kind of sums up me as a kid. I was told about how much how much he loved me, but I was told he'd send me to hell forever if I made the wrong choices. For years, my life felt like a trap door that could open any moment in eternal suffering. That's literally what I believed. And I found that I wasn't alone when I got older. I started talking to some other people. There's an idea called the rapture, and I'm running short on time, but this idea that Jesus is going to come back. And I was taught that if I wasn't ready when Jesus came back, then I would be left behind. And not being ready could mean having unconfessed sin. So I would be in my house sometimes, and it would get quiet. And if there was nobody home, and I would think, what if they were raptured? What if my parents were raptured and I'm still here by myself? Those are the types of things that some kids think. And I met a friend from Ireland years later, and he said he felt the same way. So we can end up with a lack of self-worth, judging self and others, feeling helpless. If God's judging me, I'm going to judge me. And if I'm judging me, I'm going to judge you because you're a sinner too. Again, the hypervigilance that I grew up with, Jesus is coming back at any time. There's a fear of failure. These are all things that can come. We internalize this voice of God. We're taught that God's watching over us all the time. So we start thinking that we start monitoring ourselves and telling ourselves that we're no good. So we start to sabotage ourselves. So we'll start to think, again, it's my fault. It's wild to think about it. Okay, I was born into original sin because of Adam, yet somehow it's still my fault. Things happen. I didn't have enough faith. I'm a sinner. I deserve punishment. If bad things happen to me, I deserve it. The idea that my loved one is in hell, whether it's my son, my daughter, my uncle, my husband that I couldn't save, that they're eternally being tormented, doesn't really help with grief. I'm bound for hell. And this idea that God shows favor with wealth and health, which means as long as I'm wealthy and healthy, I'm favored. But what's the flip side of that? As soon as I'm not wealthy and healthy, then I must have done something wrong. And this idea that God's out to get me, this is something that else is pretty common. I talked already about biblical literacy and infallibility. The reason why this is really important, as I said, is you kind of have to break this hold on people, at least one or the other. At least that the Bible is not infallible or it's not literal, because if you take it literally and you believe it's infallible, it doesn't make any sense. And what happens, it's just like building, Jesus talks about building a house on sand. When you build your belief on this, what happens is as soon as one thing falls apart, as soon as you find out one thing about the Bible is not true, the whole thing comes down. And I'll give you an example. A friend of mine started thinking about the story of Noah. And he was a member of the church. He literally worked for the church. And he started thinking about the story of Noah and God killing every animal, man, woman, child on earth, except for 4 or whatever. And he goes, that doesn't make any sense. That cannot be true. Since that's not true, then none of it's true. He became not only an atheist, a materialist. He's like, there's no afterlife, there's no nothing. And that's what happens when you build your idea that the Bible has to be all or nothing. And I would like to help people understand it's not all literal. It's certainly not infallible. You can take some comfort in it. There's a lot of good stuff in it. I still quote the Bible all the time. I still like the Bible, but it's not literal. It's not infallible. And people need to understand that the Bible was not dictated by God. It was written over the course of hundreds of years by dozens of men, that there's some good things about it, some bad things about it. And it was put together in a very political way. And the more people understand that, the more they can kind of escape from this. I've talked already about Christian universalism, how that's an alternative view. If you are working with someone, it's not our job to change people's faiths. I understand that, but it's our job to at least bring people some comfort. If we can offer them alternatives and say, this is maybe a different way to read this. This is maybe a different way to understand this. And it's biblical. And it was actually the view of the early church for a few hundred years before it kind of got political. And people said, no, we need people to believe there's one life and you're in or you're out. Those were relatively new developments. So there is documentation for this, and you can find books on it. They'll talk about how this was the belief of the early church for the first 500 years. And I believe it's still supported by a well-translated Bible read through the proper lens and understanding the arc of the Bible, not just taking things out of context. This is an inclusive belief. This covers everybody. Even though it's Christian universalism, it covers everybody. And it's compatible with their faith of the youth. So for me, I said this was kind of a stepping stone out of that. When I was like, I still need to believe the Bible, I still need to believe that, I was able to take this step out of that. So what can we do? We can gently point out the contradictions without helping people draw a conclusion. So we can start to say, like, just ask probing questions. Do you really think that God would send people to hell for eternity? What does that mean to you? Does that seem fair to you for people that have done, very little wrong? What kind of sense does penal substitutionary atonement make? Did God demand payment? Stuff like that. You can encourage people to study for themselves, encourage them to ask questions. You again ask probing questions, which I already said. You can provide alternative views without being dogmatic. It's not our job to change people, but we can say, hey, have you heard about this? Have you heard about this different view? Stuff like that. That's what I would do with people. I provide people with resources. And when I find out they're open to it, I'll recommend books by Boyd Purcell, like I said, Christianity Without Insanity, or Thomas Talbot, The Inescapable Glove of God. I'll say, just read it. Just check it out yourself and come to your own conclusions. And we have to be patient. It can take years to deconstruct the program that people have had. So with that, I've got about 5 minutes left for questions, but I'm Brian Smith. If you want to know more about me, I'm at grief2growth.com. It's grief2growth.com. And thanks for listening.